welcome to the SoxProspects.com podcast. We're the web's #1 source for information on the Boston Red Sox farm system from top to bottom, from Fort Myers to Pawtucket and all stops in between. Thank you for listening. My name is Chris Hatfield. I am the executive editor of Sox Prospects, joined as always by our director of scouting, Ian Kundle. We are back up and running at full strength. The computer is back up. Well, not back up and running. We've got a new computer. Everything is cranking on all cylinders. It's a new year. And we've got a heck of an episode today, Ian.
We're back.
Yeah,
we're back
bang. With some firepower.
Mm-hmm.
We've got our special guest, who I guess was our first podcast of last year as well, by the way. Ian,
was he actually?
I think so, yeah. If he wasn't, I think we had him on the January 8th episode of 2019. So
probably our first.
It was probably our first.
Until after that,
right.
So yeah.
But we've got from the Boston Globe and noted author Alex Speier joining the podcast. We're talking Homegrown, the book. We're talking, get your head out of the gutter, people. Homegrown, the book. We're talking his Baseball America rankings. We're talking Major League questions. We've got your emails because you sent them in to podcast at SoxProspects.com.
We have live trade reactions.
Live trade reaction because the Red Sox made and announced a trade while we were talking to him. If you look at the show's length, everybody, most of that is the interview with Alex. So
it's really good, though. You should listen. We had some really good conversations.
If they've gotten this far, I'm going to assume they're going to listen to it.
Yeah, but I'm saying you should listen to the whole thing. Because, at the end, for example, we have that really interesting discussion about the Red Sox new philosophy when it comes to, developing pitching prospects, for example.
Right.
Stuff like that. You won't hear that if you don't listen to the end. So you should.
Right. So, we ran the gamut with him. We said it while he was on. We could have talked to him for about 4 hours, I think. But, he had to go right about today is the deadline for teams to exchange arbitration figures with arbitration-eligible players. Looks like the Red Sox are going to arbitration with a couple of guys. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first, as always, we want to shout out our Patreon supporters. If you go to patreon.com/SoxProspects, you can support the show and get some pretty neat perks as well. We want to, as always, thank our $5 level Patreon supporters by name. That's Sox Signatures, Kyle Costigan, Tyler Woodrow, Jeff Trainer, David Nardone, Tim Harding, Bill Stanton, Deb Kendall, Evan Kirkwood, Hurricanes 1, Chris Fox, James O'Hara, Nathan Kenyon, Andrew Wallen, David B., Ben Burnett, Al Mendel, and Kevin Katrides. If that list has changed, I still haven't been logged into the Patreon account yet from my new computer, so we'll have it updated by the next episode. So sorry if there's someone new who I haven't been able to get on that list yet. But again, patreon.com/SoxProspects. I mentioned the email. Ian, before we start talking about the Alex interview, because there's some things I want to talk about up front, both between Homegrown and his Baseball America list. What news do we have since the last episode? The last episode went up on December the 18th, so it's been a minute. But we've got some transactions. Where should we start here?
We should probably start with the signings, because that can also lead into one of the two pieces of news, which is the rookie development program, which we discussed a little bit with Alex. So we should probably mention that.
That's true. So, there's some signings that we hadn't already talked about, but the Red Sox signed minor league free agents Juremi Profar, who is Jurgen Profar's younger brother.
Correct.
He is an infielder. They signed catcher Joe DeCarlo, catcher/third baseman Joe DeCarlo. They signed catcher Jett Bandy, outfielder John Andreoli, who is from Worcester, I believe. And went to UConn with Matt Barnes, among others.
George Springer also.
And George Springer, yep. And why can I never remember the new
Nick Ahmed was the shortstop.
The new assistant hitting coach.
Oh, of the Red Sox? Yeah, I don't know his name.
I can't remember his name. I'll find it in a minute. Mike Kickham, who is a starting pitcher. Mm-hmm. Relief pitcher RJ Alvarez. They claimed relief pitcher Chris Mazza off waivers from New York, which is a little different. They re-signed relief pitcher Robinson Leyer, who was in Portland for part of the year last year, and they brought back as a minor league free agent old friend first baseman/outfielder Nick Longhi, who had been with the Reds organization since they traded him for international free agent signing bonus cap money a few years back.
Longhi actually had a pretty good year last year. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, no, he did pretty well.
Like 283, 336, 463, 12 home runs.
Yeah, so they announced these when they did. Basically, they with most of these guys, my assumption is they agreed with them before, but we're waiting to announce it so they didn't get popped in Rule 5.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, with what you saw from Robinson Leyer last year, and we've talked about him, Ian, not without the realm of possibility he gets popped. If he's 98 to 100.
No, yeah, he's like 97, 99, top to 100.
Yeah.
He had a good slider, but I guess like just consistency is a major issue.
I wouldn't have predicted him to get popped, but he could have.
His delivery is atrocious too.
Right.
It's so bad, but in the sense of like it's impossible to repeat and he's probably going to get hurt, but the stuff is very impressive, I would say. Mm-hmm. And this is a side note, but I have been operating under the impression for his entire career that the catcher's name was Jeff Bandy. I had no idea it was Jett Bandy until today.
Nice.
I Googled it because I assumed it was a typo, and it was not a typo.
Well, minor league T, lowercase T, Jesus.
Yeah.
Does sort of, if you're looking quickly, look like an F.
Well, no, but I just always thought his name was Jeff Bandy because I was like, who's named Jett? Like nobody is.
With 2 T's, yeah.
Except for like the shoeless or what is it? The Jett Jackson guy from Disney Channel from way back in the day. That was the only thing I could remember. But yeah.
Don't know who that is.
Yeah, you're a boomer. That's not surprising.
I'm not a boomer.
You're old.
Yes. Anyway, I don't know that there's much to say about those guys in a nutshell. The Red Sox did also sign a backup catcher when they signed Kevin Plawecki on January the 2nd. Interesting in part because he was with the Indians who traded for Sandy Leon and basically waived him to make room for Sandy Leon. Am I missing something in that I would rather Plawecki?
No, I completely agree. I mean, he's not good, but like he's
a great backup catcher. He's a fine backup catcher.
And he costs, a third of what Leon did? Because he's like $900K?
Not a third, because Leon signed for 2. So it's a little less than half.
A little less than half. But that's like, when we kind of talked about what the Red Sox needed to do is like saving money where they can and being more creative. This is a great example of it. Like it would have been very easy to retain Leon, someone we know we know he's the pitching savior, of course. I'm kidding. Instead, they moved him on, brought someone in who can perform a similar job and saved, $1.1 million. When your team operating with financial constraints that they apparently are, that's the kind of thing you have to do. And even if you aren't operating with financial constraints, frankly, that's good business. We're
going to save $1.1 million by bringing in a better player who's under team control for an extra year.
Yeah. So
I don't get the downside to that.
I don't either. So I like the move. It's interesting, and with that, Sam Travis was designated for assignment, and he eventually did clear and was outrighted to Pawtucket,
right? Which
I think kind of shows that what we've been talking about a lot, that right corner guys just don't have a very big hit. It's when you see it year after year, the guy I always go back to is CJ Cron. He's been on he gets DFA'd after or non-tendered after every year, even though he's a consistent 25 home run, 270 hitter.
Yeah.
And the reason is because just that kind of guy is so readily available. And I think that's kind of like the problem Travis has run into is he's a right guy who he doesn't do anything great. He can hit lefties a little bit, he's a pretty good athlete, but he doesn't have a lot of power. It's just such a fungible profile that, it made sense for them to take him off the 40-man and then that he cleared. So, I mean, he's a good depth guy in Pawtucket, but I'm just not sure he's ever anything, with the Red Sox going forward.
Yeah, I mean, because he could still make the Major League club out of spring training in theory as it's constructed currently.
But that's the thing. That's what's interesting to me is, and what kind of we hinted at with Alex, is there have to be moves coming because they don't have a backup outfielder right now, unless they're moving Tzu-Wei to full-time outfield. But if they do that, I don't know what they're doing in the infield because they just DFA'd the most big league ready backup infielder they have.
Right.
With the trade they made today, which I guess we can mention now. But
yeah. So the Red Sox traded for Miami Marlins right-handed pitcher Austin Bryce. Bryce has made 106 Major League appearances, all in relief for the Marlins in 16 and 19, and the Reds in 17 and 18. Last year, he had a 3.43 ERA and 44 2/3 innings, 36 appearances. 9.27 K per nine. This is all from the Red Sox release. Held opponents to a 214 batting average and a 676 OPS against. He became the first player born in Hong Kong to appear in a major league game. Did not know that. So that's interesting. The Red Sox traded Dominican League shortstop Angeudis Santos, or I don't know how it's pronounced, Angeudis. I could not have told. If you asked me to name every player in the minor league system, I would never have. I didn't know.
All right, let's play a game. Is he a right-handed hitter or a left-handed hitter?
He's a shortstop, so I'll assume right-handed.
No, left-handed. He's also, we have him listed as a third baseman, but
he made 50 starts at shortstop last year. Last year he hit 184 with 30 runs scored and 13 RBI in 56 games.
He was the guy. He had 4 extra base hits in 174 at bats last year.
Yeah.
So, yeah, who knows?
Bigger piece of this, as you mentioned, is that Marco Hernandez has been designated for assignment
again.
Well, no, he got non-tendered.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
First time.
So he didn't have to clear like the waivers then. So if he
clears, they could outright him.
I think he might get claimed. I would not be surprised.
I would think he gets claimed.
Yeah, I think it's probably especially on a split contract.
Especially on a split contract with options remaining.
Why did they DFA him instead of Ryan Weber?
That's interesting to me.
I don't get that. Because they just, the reason I was going to mention this is they don't have a lot of infield depth on their 40-man roster.
Looking at the 40-man roster, it's who would you rather have DFA'd? And I'm looking at the list right now. I would rather have DFA'd Hector Velasquez. Agree or disagree?
Probably disagree. He's a usable arm. I mean, yeah, whatever, sure. Yeah, probably agree. I get why they didn't. I can make that case.
I would have to think about whether I prefer him or Tzu-Wei Lin.
I prefer Tzu-Wei Lin. Just more versatility. He can run also.
But Lin is out of options.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Lin might have had more of a chance to clear because he's out of options.
But I think that's a signal that they think Lin is going to make the big league team, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. Marco Hernandez does have one option remaining.
The Ryan Weber one is the one I don't know.
I mean, Bobby Pointer.
Same thing. Bobby Pointer is
Bobby Pointer, Marcus Walden. I would rather have Walden. I don't know that I'd rather have Bobby Pointer.
I don't think I would. I'd rather have the hitter.
I would rather have Brazier because of the upside, which is not terribly high, but there's upside. Colton Brewer.
Yeah, I'd probably have Brewer. But the thing is, they have so many right-handed relievers. That's why I keep going back to Ryan Weber.
Ryan Weber's the weird one. I think Denny Reyes would clear too.
Yeah, so the Giants would probably claim him, but. It's an interesting move, which makes me think that there has to be something coming with infield because I can't see the Red Sox going into the season with Tzu-Wei Lin and Jonathan Arose as their major league infield depth, and then CJ Chatham is literally the only guy in AAA. You know what I mean?
And meanwhile, Michael Chavis is your starting first baseman.
Yeah, that's the other part of it too. So you don't even have him to play at second base.
You can't even platoon him right now with this roster.
No. Well, they only have righties for first base and second base right now.
Right. You can't even platoon him because Sam Travis cleared and is in Pawtucket.
Well, Sam Travis is a righty also.
Right. Oh, that's true. That's a good point.
They don't have any left-handed hitters, really. I mean, Tzu-Wei Lin is, but he's not a guy you platoon someone with, if that makes sense.
Right.
So the roster doesn't make sense as currently constituted, which means there has to be more moves, and we know there has to be because of the financial things they're doing. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I have a feeling at some point this offseason we're going to be recording an emergency podcast.
Yeah. Oh, that's coming. Yeah, it's definitely coming.
But in Bryce, do you have any thoughts? I mean, I don't know.
It's another arm. Does he have options remaining?
Red Sox Stats had a good breakdown of him. Just had some video and some stuff about his fastball, and it's an interesting pitch mix. Get him in the lab, see what happens. I mean, I don't really have a lot to add other than that. If you want more info, I would just go on that. Check his Twitter. He's got a good video of him. The stuff looks pretty good though. It's mid-90s fastball, decent breaking ball.
All right. Austin, I'm trying to see if Austin Bryce has options remaining. Peter Fatsy's the assistant hitting coach I was thinking of. He's a UConn grad.
Gotcha.
Austin Bryce. There's an article from 2013, Austin Bryce and the value of the release point. Let's see here. No options remaining for Austin Bryce.
Well, he was DFA'd, so yeah. Does that mean he has no options left?
No, you could DFA a guy with options. For example, Marco Hernandez today.
Oh, yeah. That was a dumb statement. You can edit that out. He's ARB eligible starting next year, so this is his last rookie year.
His last year making basically the minimum?
Yeah. And then
They must see something with him.
His numbers weren't bad last year. Like 44 innings, 1.23 WHIP, 3.43 ERA. FIP is almost 5, which is not good, but struck out 46 a guy an inning. So I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking at the roster right now, and I'm trying to think of who in our projections is down in the minors on opening day. I guess Marcus Walden has options, so he probably becomes depth because Hembry doesn't have options. Does Brazier have options?
Yeah,
Brazier has
1, maybe 2.
He has one option on Fangraphs, but that's pre-2019.
No, he has 1 because I'm looking at our site. He's used one in 2013 and then another one in 2019. So
okay.
He has 1 left.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's an interesting depth move. I mean, it's another right-handed reliever though, and so I don't know where they're going to find the roster spots for all these guys. So we'll see.
All right. I think that's about it for news. There's no news on the trade front. There's no news on the Noah Song front. Yeah. Let's talk quick about stuff for the Alex interview. Mm-hmm. First, just so you'll need it for context, his Baseball America top 10 prospects list, and maybe we could talk a shade about this if you want, Ian, goes as follows. His top 10 is Triston Casas at 1, Bobby Dalbec at 2, Bryan Mazza at 3, Jarren Duran at 4, Darwinzon Hernandez at 5, basically Baseball America's rankings rules. Darwinzon hasn't graduated yet, even though he's basically like a third of an inning from graduating under them. We graduated him because of service time. So he is still on the list. He's at 5. Thad Ward at 6, Jay Groom at 7, Gilberto Jimenez at 8, Noah Song at 9, and Tanner Houck at 10. So that's his list for context when you hear us talking about it. We talk about his top 30 ranking. We don't release it, A, because it's technically part of the handbook.
It's like premium content.
And B, we have his list. There's editorial discretion for them to edit it. It's just how he submits it. So we don't know that's what's even going to wind up in the handbook. So we'll refer to where guys are on that list in a general sense. Yeah. Ian, did anything surprise you about this list or what we talked about with him?
Not really. I mean, I think it was
as far as the list goes, at least. What we talked about with him.
No. I mean, we have the same like top. I want to say like 12 or something, or top 10, like the same players, not necessarily in the same order.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's 10 of the first 11 are the same, something like that. So we're pretty, like, the names are all the same for the most part, going down to like 30. He has a couple interesting guys in there that I think we mentioned, but for the most part, it's pretty similar, I would say. Yeah,
we never wound up talking about Brainer Bonacci, who he had much higher than us.
Yeah, it's actually the second place that he's been pretty high, because I was on the Baseball America just put out their top 20 DSL prospects from last year.
Yeah, he was 8, right?
And he was 8 or 9. I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah,
he was 8. He was 8.
Yeah, those lists are interesting because I think they're. I don't know.
Badler knows the Dominican market. Like, Ben Badler does a great job covering it.
Was that a Badler list or was that a league list?
No, it's Ben Badler's list. It's his list of the top Latin guys from last year that played in the DSL and not really stateside. So I don't know. It was interesting to me that because I saw Boccia. This was part of what happens when we don't have instructs like we usually do. He's someone that if I had seen an instructs and liked what I saw, then probably would have been higher on the list. But because I only literally saw him like take like 3 at bats against a pitching machine, it was just, he's just someone we weren't comfortable like pushing up, and no one scouts the the Dominican Summer League really. So it was just hard for us to get info on him. So he's someone that I could see rising considerably after spring training, depending. But I mean, I just remember him being really small and very athletic. That was about it.
Yeah. And actually, Fangraphs has Bonacci at 16 on their list as well. So we might need to re-examine where we have him. Yeah,
I mean, we have him in the top 40, and as we said, like from like 20 to 30, 20 to 40, it's whatever.
And as we talk about with Alex in the podcast, the guys that are that far away have so much volatility. We talk about it with him with respect to Anthony Flores and Danny Diaz.
Exactly.
Both who've had precipitous falls on his list as well as ours. He actually dropped them further than we did. So that's an interesting conversation with Alex on that front. And then just some stuff about the book Homegrown. We talked with him about a lot of stuff. I had a lot of things I wanted to ask about. We could have done an hour just on Homegrown. I say it when we're talking with him. I recommend it. If you're listening to this podcast, there's no reason for you to not buy and read the book. It's basically, as I say on our interview with him, it's kind of like the story of what we've covered dating back to like the 2011 draft season. There's some crazy, anecdotes in there. I mean, one of the first scenes he sets, Ian, is the signing deadline for the 2011 draft. When back then how it worked was literally there was a midnight deadline, and you would call the player's not agent, family advisor or whatever the hell it was, or call the family, literally at 11:55 to negotiate, which is bananas. And one of the things I wanted to ask about that we just ran out of time to ask about is just like, how did people see this as the most efficient way to negotiate? Like, I get waiting because there's a deadline and that forces action, but it's like, you couldn't have called at 11? Like, it had to be 11:55? And they're sending in these agreements. Like, if someone's phone went down, they wouldn't have signed, like, Henry Owens. You know what I mean? Like, they wouldn't have signed Mookie Betts. Although I think they got Betts done a little earlier in the evening, but, like, it does kind of talk about some things. Like, it dispelled the myth of Mookie Betts was signed with the money that Senquez Galson turned down, because Galson's offer was on the table. He was there at midnight. He could have signed at 11:59, and they had already signed Mookie Betts. So it dispels that. He also made very clear in there something that I think we had clarified on here, but this confirmed it. In the Chris Sale deal, it had been reported that Dave Dombrowski had refused to include Rafael Devers. It clarifies that he refused to include him as the third player in the deal, in addition to Yohan Moncada and Michael Kopech. And basically says in there he probably would have done it for Kopech and Devers, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, I mean, Moncada's a very good player too, though. I think it was an either or with Moncada or Devers.
Which makes sense to me if you're going to do the deal, given their prospect status at the time. I mean, Moncada was thought of as the better prospect.
He's not now, but yeah.
He's definitely not now. But then I think, I would have traded Devers for Moncada at the time. I would probably have thought
because at that time, too, it was thought that Moncada could stay up the middle. He's faster, better athlete, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would have with the information we had. I don't know if I would have with more information, put it that way.
No.
So there's that. Also, a bit that was in there. And we talk a little bit about Dombrowski's management style and his the way he does things.
Confrontational?
Well, there's that piece of it, too. But it did confirm, and it does confirm in the book, that members of the front office were upset about Logan Allen's inclusion in the criteria.
That's what we said.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's at the time.
We knew that at the time. Like, I'm pretty sure in our reaction pod, we were like, wait, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, why did you have to include him?
Yeah.
And it literally, shows basically the Padres were just kind of like, hey, would you include him? And he's like, sure.
They're at an all-you-can-eat buffet. We'd like that. We would like that. Ooh, can we have that also? Ooh, maybe that one too. Sure, take it all.
I wouldn't say. I think the better analogy. It's not like an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's like a car negotiation, in which you're saying add the tinted windows and the heated seats, and I'm in, or something like.
Then why don't you also throw in a moonroof or something? Okay, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, but what about mud guard or something. Yeah, just keeps going.
So, I mean, there's all kinds of nuggets like that in there.
It's a great book. You should read it.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome. Anything else you think we need to...
Well, we should mention the rookie development program since we talked about...
the rookie development program, yeah, because I also said that we would say who the participants were. So the rookie development program is back this year.
They didn't do it last year, right?
Correct. They didn't do it last year. They did it in 2017 and 2018. They didn't do it in 2016. So, So at any rate, it is back this year. What? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Right. Sorry. One last thing is, the list of players. It is, all right, here it is. The players participating are outfielders Jarren, Duran, and Marcus Wilson. Infielders Jonathan Arose, CJ Chatham, and Bobby Dalbec. Left-handers Yohan Ibar and Kyle Hart, and right-handers Durbin Feltman, Tanner Houck, Robinson Leyer, Bryan Mazza, and Thaddeus Ward. Surprises, I mean, the one that stands out. Well, the one of these things is not like the others. Names on the list are, of course, Arose, but he's on there because he's the Rule 5 pick, and Robinson Leyer. And Alex had the good point that maybe he's on the list as an incentive for him to resign.
I didn't think about that. That's a really good point, though.
Yeah, that was a really good point. I mean, he also, with his stuff, I could see him coming up, but that's an interesting point. That's 2, 4, 6, 8. Let's see, 2, 5, 7, 9, 12 guys, which is about the size they usually have. Seems to trend a shade young. Anything else stick out to you about the list, Ian?
Not really.
Yeah, I mean it's a shade young in that they've got 3 guys on the list who weren't in Double A yet last year, and Arose, Ibar, and Ward.
But I think we kind of like
Ibar's on the 40 and Arose.
Ibar's on the 40. Arose is going to be in the big leagues, and as we talked about with Alex, Ward is someone who could move pretty quickly.
So makes sense. I could also see them not doing it next year because this is that wave of players. I don't know that you get 12 guys that aren't on this list that need the program next year. I don't know.
We'll see.
We'll see. But at any rate, so that's the list of rookie development program guys. I think that's about it. Should we throw it to the Alex interview, Ian? Let's do it. All right, here's Alex. All right, well, we are joined at this time once again by our most often returning and one of our favorite guests to have here on the pod from the Boston Globe and now published author, Alex Speier. Welcome back, man. Happy New Year. We've been hoping to have you on for a minute, and we're finally able to make it happen. As always, we appreciate you coming on, man.
Am I, in fact, the most frequent guest of the podcast?
I know that without even looking. It's either you or you or Jim Callis.
Longevity has its rewards.
Well, I mean, it's the combination of we actually like you, which is good, and the fact that if you've been covering the system for longer than anyone on the Red Sox beat. I feel like with any kind of depth beyond who hit the most home runs this month. So. We love having you on. We love talking about the farm system as we've done a number of times and getting your insight on the Major League team. But, of course, this year there is the added topic we have to discuss of Homegrown, how the Red Sox built a champion from the ground up. First of all, congrats, man. I mean, I'm always kind of in awe of how beat writers, especially for a Major League team where, you're talking – February through, for a successful team, October, never mind everything that happens in the offseason. It's not like, the NFL where you've got dead periods during the offseason. How you find the time to do something like this. I, of course, have read it. I
admire the fact that you've put in tabs as talking points. So this is exciting.
I sent that picture out, and then I looked out about it. I'm like, I hope that didn't intimidate him. Not that you'd be intimidated.
I appreciated the fact that you took the time to read it and then to identify, and then to identify stuff you want to talk about. I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, well, it's what it is when you're reading it in 15-minute increments on the train. You got to make sure you're noting stuff you want to call back to. And I guess just to start for those listening, of course. let me put it this way. One of the tabs, I noticed this is all the way in on page 305, but I thought this was a great summary of the book that, I think you had kind of meant as a summary of the team, but if I can just kind of quote this. A span of a few years had offered a baseball lifetime of shared experiences that ran a remarkable gamut. An education in professional life, a prospect's infinite sense of possibility, and then certain lesson in humility. The weight of collective failure embodied by the big league team's 2 last-place finishes. Massive leadership change inside and outside the clubhouse. The collective breakthrough that propelled the Red Sox from that organizational nadir to 3 straight first-place finishes in the American League East. The last, a historic trampling of opponents. An example of both, the fact that you're really good at this writing thing. And honestly, I think that that's a good summation probably of what the book's about.
I mean, that broader arc is what was interesting to me and probably, and hopefully to you guys too, as people who appreciate that what we see in any given season, in any given moment is not a reflection of that season or of that moment, but instead, particularly in baseball, which is the one sport that bakes in years and years of a player development process that is, typically wobbly and very uncertain. That it for that Red Sox group to be in a position to win in 2018, it was the culmination of a long period of their lives together, and that entailed a lot more than just what we might see on the back of a baseball card or on a baseball reference page. Mm-hmm. But there is both enormous individual growth that occurred for all of those players. I mean, you guys probably remember better than almost anyone what tiny Mookie Betts looked like trying to, in Lowell back in 2012 when he couldn't hit a ball to the warning track. Yep. In what it took to get him to where he is, it occurs on an individual level. And I do think that we underappreciate the fact that there is also kind of a collective phenomenon at work in the creation and building of organizations that steps forward are usually taken collectively, not individually. And I think that along the way, one of the things that I really enjoyed doing with the book was identifying areas where that occurred with that group of Xander Bogaerts and Jackie Bradley Jr. and Mookie Betts and Andrew Benintendi and others who kind of joined along the way. So I think that great job highlighting a paragraph that is indeed I think that does that's a pretty accurate that's a pretty good microcosm of what I was trying to get at in the book.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I love the book, and for our audience, I would probably describe it as if you're someone who's been reading the website for a long time and following the farm system for a long time and reading Alex's writing for a long time, you get these great behind-the-scenes nuggets of things you may not have known, or even just reminders of things that you might have forgotten. I know, I found things in there that I remembered reading first in minor details back in probably 2012 or something, or 2011. The point about Jackie Bradley when he was in high school would take an entire season taking to two strikes so he could work on a 2-strike approach and things like that. I hadn't thought about that in years, and it was great to remind myself of that. On the other hand, if you've come to, expanding your Red Sox fandom beyond the 25-man roster recently, this is the catch-up book. This is the primer of here's what's been going on since roughly the 2011 draft. Of course, you've got the scouting of those guys too, so it's before the draft. But, this is really kind of, I almost would call it the story that we've been covering here at the website at Sox Prospects since that time. I mean, this is, in book form, in a 334-page book, what's been happening. And, there are books that come out, Alex, after every championship that happens, as we in Boston sports fandom have come to know all too well over the last 2 decades. But this did not feel like the team won a championship, we're going to write a book about it type book. And the acknowledgments in the book you talk a little bit about the impetus for the project, but, tell us, how did you first kind of start thinking of this project? It seems like it predated the World Series win, and kind of how did it, over time evolve to what this was?
It did. initial idea wasn't going to be this because the initial idea occurred before the 2018 season. It occurred focused around a different group. You'll probably appreciate this more than most. In 2015, I got a chance to go down to Greenville for Moncada's debut, and when I did so, on the flight down, it kind of struck me, well, okay, so he just became the most expensive prospect ever, right?
Right.
We now have market value for a super elite prospect, and that's interesting in its own right. But and he obviously is interesting in his own right, and he's going to be on a team where he might not be the best player. He might not have the best major league career of anyone on that team. He might not have the fifth best career of anyone on that minor league team. It was the Greenville drive. It was he was already he was joining an infield that already had Rafael Devers, who obviously looked like a prodigy. It had Javier Guerra, who, at the time looked like he was coming as a potentially really, really good prospect, as a legit, everyday shortstop prospect with power. There was Michael Chavis, who, of course, was in his first full pro season, coming out of being a first rounder. There was Michael Kopech, same boat, first full pro season, throwing 100, so turning a lot of heads. Later that season, they were joined by Anderson Espinoza. They were joined by Andrew Benintendi. So it was this incredible cluster of talent. I'm not even mentioning Jalen Beeks, Nick Longhi, other guys who looked like potential big leaguers. But, going down there, getting to hang out with those guys in that context is kind of like the, we're also here group that surrounded Mauricio Dubon, group that surrounded this really kind of headliner prospect. I thought, well, if you followed the trajectory of just this group, over the course of, let's say, the next 5 years, 7 years, you'd probably be able to say some really interesting things about how player development works, how player growth works over the course of times, and how organizations function. So that thought had always been in my mind, but, life is busy, and, I have kids, I have this job. So it had kind of been something I had continued to research over the years without working on shaping it into a book. But then as 2018 is unfolding, and especially once I got to the playoffs, it was well, wait a second. I have this framework, that I've already been building with the 2015 team and some ideas related to what a book about prospect growth might look like. And I've also been paying attention on kind of a daily basis to the core that preceded that one, namely, Mookie and Jackie and Xander, and it was back in 2012 that when I was still with EEI.com that I started doing minor details and thinking every day about what was happening in the Red Sox farm system. And it was oh, well, this could be a really interesting wave. And so, there was a lot of raw material there to work with. And it was just kind of a question of, during that postseason run, thinking, okay, if they win, what would be a worthwhile project that wouldn't just be tied to the success of that one 2018 team. The characters would be more memorable because of their success, but how would you tell a story? How would you give people insight into how player development works and the people who are a part of it, not just the players, but the coaches, the front office members, who are invested in seeing young men and kids, really, in a lot of cases, teenagers, right, grow up. And so that's kind of how the project idea formed. And so I committed to doing it in November of 2018, and turned it around about 5 months later.
That's quick. I'm quick. Impressed. I had no idea it was that quick. And that team, I actually looked when I was seeing that in the acknowledgments. 14 major leaguers on that low A team, and it could be 15 if, say, Nick Longhi makes it to the majors, which seems quite possible. Just a cop. Yeah, and you're looking at and thus far. They haven't had their all-star yet, but Benintendi, Devers, Benintendi, Devers, Moncada have all been pretty darn good so far. And, TBD on what Kopech becomes, but, he's it'll be awfully interesting to see him back on the mound this year. For sure, yeah. just I guess starting to go through some of these stuff in there, you obviously definitely talk to a lot of these guys, the players, the front office, the coaches. I guess in particular with the front office guys, they're not a population that you tend to see quoted a lot in these kind of things. I feel like, in part because, no one generally necessarily thinks to, usually you've got the players and the coaches, but, it's not like, David Halberstam is talking to the, the director of amateur scouting or something like that. But, how much were these guys interested in talking to you about this? Obviously, on the one hand, talk to a scout at the game on a day he wants to talk to you, and he'll tell you the nuclear codes. But on the other hand, some of this is kind of giving away the secret sauce a little bit. How forthcoming maybe isn't quite the right word, but as far as getting them to talk to you for the book, how did that kind of work out? And obviously, these are guys you're familiar with, it's kind of the same way we are, so that helped.
Yeah,
but, how was that process?
I think that honestly, there was. I think that because of the nature of the way that that this was being approached, that there was a general willingness and almost an eagerness to be able to share stories about not necessarily one individual claiming his or her role in helping a player along, but instead being able to credit other people who are behind the scenes helping someone. So
right.
Like Eddie Romero, who's the assistant general manager and who was a longtime director of international scouting, international amateur scouting, had previously been in international player development. He was excited to be able to say, oh yeah, behind the scenes, like Jose Zapata in the Dominican Academy has been unbelievable in terms of what kind of impact he's been able to make on, Rafael Devers and other players coming out of the Dominican Academy. Or he was excited to be able to talk about the scouting role that someone like Manny Nanita, again, someone who is not going to be talked about on a daily basis in the conversation about Rafael Devers. But, people in the organization are excited for the opportunity to give credit to other people who might not have had a light shown on them, and obviously foremost the credit goes to the players, but there's also an investment on the part of the people in the organization in these guys as not just players but people, and having seen them grow up and having seen what they evolved into over the course of that time. So beyond that, they were coming off of the halo of 2018. So I think that people were generally a good mood about talking about just about anything related to the growth of that group. So I felt very fortunate to have really, very good access to a number of people for some very, interesting and valuable and insightful conversations that I hope makes the book worthwhile for people reading it and allows them like me to find out a lot of stuff by reading it.
Yeah, that actually is probably a good segue into another thing I wanted to ask you about. At one point, I believe when you're discussing Ben Cherington, it describes in the book, and this is like partially quoted, partially paraphrased, so forgive me, but implementing numerous programs meant to ease some of the jarring lifestyle transitions faced by minor leaguers, including mental skills to nutrition to cultural adaptation for players coming to the U.S. from Latin America. And, that kind of struck me as touching on a number of things that you and we just, talk about on a daily basis, but, also things that are really top of mind right now when you talk about things like, minor league pay and lifestyles and things like that. And then you talk a lot in the book about the challenges that some of these guys like Bradley and Betts and Bogarts faced when they first got to MLB, never mind when they first got to the States. As you were, researching, or I don't know if it's researching or reporting, but, gathering facts for the book and, of course, in your reporting as well, what do you feel are areas the Red Sox over time have succeeded in those kind of things with player dev and maybe a little bit in amateur scouting? And what areas do you think they've, maybe got a little bit of room to improve or could do better at or maybe have improved upon that they were once bad at and now are a lot better at?
I think, so first of all, there's kind of like these general areas of kind of sports science that that's a broad area that like has grown a lot over the course of these last 15 years. But I do think that the Red Sox, once Ben Cherington took over as farm director back in 2002, they were generally ahead of the curve in thinking about players from a holistic development standpoint. So thinking about meeting their needs on and off the field, supporting them, and trying to give them instruction and better nutrition. And they were a bit ahead of the curve, at least initially, in terms of when they hired Bob Tewksbury as a mental skills instructor. The presence of Raquel Ferreira, who's become a bit more prominent in the Red Sox organization in recent years, but she was a remarkable asset in terms of someone who was who allowed players to understand that they had kind of they had someone in the organization who cared about them as people and not just as as organizational assets. And so she was kind of, her role is somewhat amorphous in many ways, but it's enormous in terms of helping. She was just extremely impressive in terms of helping players to understand like how to deal with their money and how to deal with their responsibilities and how to remain connected to home and just in a number of facets. So I think that the Red Sox were ahead of the curve starting in the early 2000s. I think that the rest of the league probably caught up and in some cases surpassed them in a number of fields over the course of time. And I think that that's and I think that the Red Sox probably then subsequently caught up. They built Ben Cherington spent a lot of kind of his latter tenure as a general manager thinking again about mental skills and behavioral health as an issue where he thought the Red Sox needed to do a better job of supporting the needs of their players, on and off the field, and again, kind of building out their mental skills program to have more reach, building out their nutrition program in order to do a better job of helping young players with not a lot of money make the right choices in terms of that might maximize their development and their overall health. So I think that it would be a little bit misleading to say the Red Sox were ahead here, behind here, because I think that, it's kind of cyclical and, but I do think that the Red Sox for a time were ahead. I think that they probably lapsed back to the pack. And I think that maybe some of the focus that Ben Cherington reestablished on how to help players in, more broadly than just on the field in 2015 ended up paying dividends for the group that ultimately won. And then there's a separate question entirely related to kind of data-driven development that's occurring throughout the game. And in that respect, I think that the consensus is that, frankly, the Red Sox had been and probably had been behind other teams for at least much of this past half decade or so, and they were playing catch up. I think that they've done a pretty good job of playing catch up, of advancing to a point where their ability to use pitch data in order to help pitchers tinker with their repertoires and with their deliveries they've advanced a lot, and I think that you're seeing fruits of that that are probably underappreciated in terms of the number of guys who are progressing through the Red Sox farm system and coming up ready to make an impact at the big league level is something that we haven't seen in at least a few years, and maybe more than that when you talk about like Darwinson Hernandez and Josh Taylor and others who have been coming through the system. So at any rate, that's a long-winded way of saying there have been areas where the Red Sox have had competitive advantages, others where they've been behind over the course of time. And ultimately, the thing that positioned them to have that fantastic core of 2018 was a coincidence of their player development system working well at that time, and also a number of hits on scouting on guys who they had scouted, including some of the vastly exceeded projections like Mookie Betts and some that nailed projections like Andrew Benintendi. Even with some misses in there were enough hits that it created this fantastic foundation for them moving forward.
Yeah, there's you mentioned the hits and misses, and one of the final, I think it might be the epilogue where you kind of get into here's what happened to Henry Owens and Blake Swihart and some of these other guys that are mentioned, and then we don't really have have space for. I mean, I got the sense where reading this, I bet if you had unlimited time and unlimited pages, this could have been War and Peace Part 2. Is that correct?
That's the case for just about every article I write.
Right.
So yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that, there are a lot of rabbit holes that you can go down in the player development world, right? When you're dealing with the 175, minor league players or whatever that you have at a time. There are all kinds of different directions that you can go in, especially Mauricio Dubon. I could have done, a full chapter on him, or when I was thinking about it for the 2015 Greenville Drive, the idea was, maybe one chapter Moncada, one chapter Benintendi, one on Kopech, one on Chavis, and each of them, you could easily do that with every player who's been interesting in the system over the course of the last many years.
Oh, for sure. I mean, even some of the guys that, the stories like Williams Harris could be an interesting chapter, right? Who he was on that team.
Yeah, I mean, and traded in 2018 in order to get Kinsler, so you can. So again, there's the rabbit hole that you can go down.
Right.
Jalen Beeks, super interesting in the context of this, because Beeks represents kind of the first guy who had been, had been developed via pitch data to vastly exceed his value from where he was drafted and become something really, really valuable.
Yeah, he's like the Brian Bannister, first shot fired, almost sort of. It seems like. I remember reading the Beeks Santiago Espinal section, which I think winds up being only a few pages just because it kind of has to be to tell the story. But I'm just reading it, I was thinking Alex, I bet wanted to make this a chapter. I guarantee you he wanted to make this a chapter.
Could have done it. Yeah,
I'm sure. With that, I've got some things that were interesting, the specific pieces of the book, but I don't want to, I could spend about 2 hours talking about this with you, but I don't think necessarily anyone wants to listen to that or we don't have time to. But were there any specific things that either, surprised you in not digging up facts, but getting facts about the book, about the way certain things went, or, particularly stood out to you as things that you learned or things that you were reminded of, perhaps, in the way that reading some things that I had read you report on before reminded me of them, that stood out as particularly, like I said, surprising or more interesting than others, or, because thinking of things or there'll be things I want to ask you about specifically, but did anything kind of stand out to you as kind of a whoa moment during that kind of 5 months?
Yeah, I guess that, I was certainly surprised by the degree to which the players coming up in 2014, Betts, Bradley, and Bogarts, just how hard that environment was for them, and how very lonely and kind of painful it was for them to be in the big leagues at that time. It was that was kind of deeply personal and raw for them in some respects, and their the honesty with which they presented that, I thought, really afforded me some insight into something that I maybe hadn't quite fully appreciated at the time, even as I tried to be attuned to it. But when you hear it still being raw 5 years later, it's kind of telling. I guess in terms of more specific incidents, I did not know the extent to which the relationship between John Farrell and Dave Dombrowski had frayed over the course of the 2017 season. And so, there was some, I guess that there was a degree of woe that was involved in kind of hearing that they kind of were at odds to the point of shouting matches that all of the players could hear. Yeah. And were as a result, kind of, dealing with, some drama for the rest of the season. Rafael Devers getting in trouble is kind of fun too. So,
when he was going to get called up to the States.
Endearing. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't remember if I knew that or not, because it seemed familiar, but I didn't know if I was thinking about someone else or something, but that was interesting. We will let people buy the book to hear about that one, but that was very interesting to read. The two things that you mentioned actually were two of the things that stood out to me. In particular, one of the first kind of, bomb is probably overstating it, but one of the things I read that really caught my attention was, reading about how close was Mookie Betts, and I guess this is actually more in the minors early in his career than when he got up to the majors. You mentioned that he said he was close to hanging it up, or thinking about it at least. Like, how real do you think that was when he says that, he was thinking about stepping away from the game?
I mean, real enough that he was actually talking to college basketball programs about whether or not he would be able to play for them. He was talking to a couple of schools that were close to his home in Nashville, and about saying, enough of baseball. Like, I'm not into this for being a 150 hitter, and this isn't what I signed on for. So he was pretty discouraged in Greenville early in that 2013 season before things really took off. Although, he would have had to wrestle with the idea that he would have also been leaving some money on the table, because he had a split bonus, which means that his $750,000 were being divided up over 5 years. Interestingly enough, his last bonus payment came when he was already in the big leagues. Oh
my God, that's right.
Yeah,
I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, no, he actually, and Amiel Sade had a good laugh about it because, Amiel was like, hey, Mookie, we just paid you your last check. And he was like, oh, cool, man.
Meanwhile, today he sets the record for a pre-arb or arbitration, avoiding arbitration contract.
Yes.
$27 million.
He's up from $150,000 payments to, well, I guess that's kind of going to be a night overnight income for him for the coming season.
Yeah. Oh my God. Hey, good work if you can get. And it's crazy to imagine that he could have stepped away from that in April of what that would have been 2013, right?
Yeah. April. Right. Had things not turned around for him, who knows if after the 2013 season he wouldn't have contemplated quitting.
Mm-hmm. Another relationship, you mentioned the Farrell Dombrowski fraying of the relationship, which, even you that had been reported. I remember reading about that meeting, but then just seeing it, like you said, just how much it affected the clubhouse and affected that relationship. Another relationship that I found interesting was the John Henry, Ben Cherington dynamic kind of at the end. When, Mark Shapiro had been brought in as the consultant, and then just the timeline of
Jerry Dipoto as the consultant.
Jerry Dipoto. Sorry.
Yeah,
yes,
no problem.
Wrong guy. Dipoto's brought in on day one. Henry's talking to Dombrowski on day 3, and Cherington finds out 3 days after that or something. Did John Henry,
one moved quickly.
Did John Henry? First of all, I guess the thing that I was incredulous about, did John Henry really think that Cherington was going to stay? Take a demotion there.
Because they had been having conversations there in the summer about the idea of. Ben Cherington had been open to the idea of hiring a president of baseball ops.
Right.
So, I think that it was perhaps a bit overly optimistic for John Henry to operate on that assumption.
Right.
When there was kind of a change in the process, there's also some dispute, I think, about whether or not. I don't know. This is going to sound strange. I'm not sure if John Henry felt like he didn't keep Ben Cherington informed. Ben Cherington very clearly felt like he wasn't being kept informed about the Dave Dombrowski interview. So, that's kind of, so at any rate, I think that John Henry was hopeful. He had tremendous respect for Ben Cherington and what was being cultivated at the farm system level. He just, the Red Sox were just in kind of an epic run where every major league decision they'd made, save for Alejandro De Aza from the end of the World Series through that point in August 2015, had gone awry, at least to that point. So, I think that, yes, I think that there was legitimate hope that Ben Cherington would stay. I think that, Dombrowski had been told that it was a possibility, but he was kind of guarded about it. And, he was hopeful, I think, that maybe Ben Cherington would stick around and that they could work together. But I think he was also kind of realistic that if he was being brought in, Ben might also want to leave.
Right. Right. Reading about Dombrowski's management style and just what a stark departure it was from basically everything. And, I kind of refer to it as the Epsterington era because, the Theo Epstein to Ben Cherington transition was like pretty relatively seamless. I mean, It was all the same people, more or less the same philosophies, it seemed.
Yep.
The way you describe Dombrowski in the book, it's just kind of like, yeah, you can tell me what you think. I may or may not listen, whatever. First of all, does it work just because Dombrowski's that good at player evaluation? Because I look at his management style and reading it was just like, how does this work?
He's been really good as a player, as a major league player evaluator over the course of a long period of time. And, obviously the last couple of moves that he made in Boston didn't bear the fruit that many others had over the course of, of decades in his career. But, but when you look at the kinds of moves that he's made over the course of time, whether it was creating a nucleus with the Marlins that ended up winning, whether it was, building a veteran team with the Marlins that won a championship in 98, after that, having to take a wrecking ball to that, but creating the nucleus that ended up yielding, even after he had left, the 2003 Marlins championship. There was astute player evaluation that happened, trading for Mike Lowell, going for, building an interesting power pitching infrastructure that gave them real champs, et cetera, et cetera. He has done a really good job of building elite power pitching rotations over the course of many stops throughout his career. And, he trusts that. He trusts his, he trusts that. And it's worked. It makes it, I do think that it makes people feel a bit more confined working for him than they did for Ben Cherington or for Theo Epstein, because though they are kind of solicitous of a wide range of ideas, they want to consider every possibility. Whereas Dombrowski has a more okay, these are our holes, let's address them. Like he's kind of okay with the idea of a blink, of a bit of a blink test, and recognizing that there can be good answers that are relatively straightforward ones. So it works because he's ultimately made a number of good decisions when making these evaluations, in terms of its implications for organization building. I think that's been less successful, because his eyes are trained on the major league roster, and so that's where the focus of his attention goes as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he struck me as kind of, and it was kind of fairly clear if you were paying attention even at the time. He was the right guy for what they needed at the time, but, I almost wonder, you look at a Grady Little where I remember when he got fired. Before that, it was just kind of like anything short of a World Series win. You could kind of see that coming. I almost found myself wondering, reading that part of things, in 2018 with anything short of a World Series win, I almost kind of wonder what would have happened the following offseason.
He would have won 3 straight AL East titles.
That's true.
So I think that,
I guess that's true.
So, I think that, and I don't think, I think that at the time, at the end of 2018, I think that there was a sense of alignment between Dombrowski and Red Sox owners. Yeah. I think that it was, kind of over the course of the coming months that kind of frayed.
Yeah. Well, we do have a lot to talk about. Like I said, I could talk to you for 2 hours about the book. I would definitely suggest everyone, if you're listening to this podcast, put it this way. If you are listening to the SoxProspects.com podcast, I cannot think of a legitimate reason for you not to read this book. So go pick it up at your local bookstore or, on Amazon or wherever you can get your hands on it. Borrow it from a friend. Go to the library. Get your hands on it. It's fantastic. Congrats on the book, Alex. And
thanks. It means a lot. That you guys would be enthusiastic about it. It means a lot, given that there are few. I can't imagine audiences that would be as sophisticated and as invested in this material. So I hope that it was rewarding for me to do because I got to find out stuff that I didn't know before. If the same can be said for you guys, then I feel like I've accomplished something.
Excellent. Well, speaking of the material, maybe we can transition then to the beginning of the material for Homegrown Part 2, potentially.
I'll give that a 60 grade segue. That was pretty good, but it was all right.
That's what I strive for, really. Pretty good, but with room for improvement.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, one thing we talk to you about every year, I think we've had you on every year. You've done it. Is your top prospect list. The top 10 is up on Baseball America and in your companion piece that was in the Globe and on the Globe's website. Your rankings of the farm system, your take on the farm system. Last year, Alex, I think your take was kind of, there was a certain subset of guys that could be at the top. And I remember we talked about how there were 5 or 6 guys that could have been at the top of the system. This farm system, it seems like number 1 is pretty clear, and you don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about it. And then after that, it's not all that dissimilar in the sense that it kind of depends what you like, what you value, and a whole lot of contingencies. Thinking of a couple guys in particular. What was your kind of overall take in researching this year's list, this year's set of minor leaguers, and the state of the system?
Yeah, you're right. It is different to have a clear number 1 at the top of the system, which was Triston Casas, obviously. There were some people who actually had Dalbec ahead, but it was a clear majority of people who I was talking to who had Casas at the top based on upside and what's viewed as a pretty good floor, even at the point, even though he hasn't really competed beyond a couple games above Greenville. Then 2-3 was very clear with Dalbec, Mazza, Dalbec, depending on which flavor of ice cream you like. Do you like the guy who's in AAA? Do you like the guy who's, I think that Mazza probably is viewed as having a somewhat higher ceiling, given that Dalbec is always going to come with the questions of, can he hit more than 240, 250? I think that you can make decent cases for either of them in that next spot. And then, it gets into, then it gets into kind of how optimistic a person are you, in terms of looking at what's behind that. How much are you willing to run with what Jarren Duran did in high A instead of double A? How much are you willing to run, and, over a relatively short period of time that was divorced from who he had been in college? How much are you willing to run with Thad Ward and the development of a pitch that's a serious difference maker when you're able to go, that ability to go fastball, cutter, slider instead of just fastball, slider? It's significant. Adam Ottavino is evidence of that. But, it's also relatively brief, and it's also in the lower minors. And cutters in the lower minors tend to be pitches that can dominate because people aren't used to them. What do they do when they're in the upper minors? So, I think that there's not a ton of, I think that Tanner Houck is right at the back of my top 10, and he's probably the one guy who has the fewest variables involved in his prospect status. And even he, there's a rotation versus reliever question, but the ceiling seems to be capped either way. The ceiling seems to be relatively capped as a starter and relatively decent as a reliever, to the point that there's not a lot of question about what his future value is. But beyond him, there are huge questions about what do you think Jay Groom is going to be? Is he going to be healthy? If so, will he be the guy who he looked like before he blew out in the spring of 2018? Gilberto Jimenez, no idea. Exciting, no idea. Noah Song, no idea if he's ever going to be pitching again. In his so there's just a lot of variability that goes into the guys who fall out after that top 3. And it gives the Red Sox a chance to vastly exceed projections about the limitations of their system, but it also explains why there are those limitations with regards to the projection of their system.
Alex, when you were putting the list together, and I'll go ahead and say we can expand it if this would be a good answer. Outside of the top 10 that's published into guys that you had in your personal top 30, which in some relative form will be in the Baseball America handbook, although there's editorial discretion. But was there anyone who, wound up higher than you thought they would to a significant degree? And was there anyone who wound up maybe significantly lower than you thought they would be before you started the process of putting the list together?
I was pretty surprised to hear the excitement that exists around Andrew/AJ Politi.
Mm-hmm.
He only started he had 4 starts at the very end of the season. He had been working out of the bullpen in High A Salem for the rest of the year. But what they really worked on the shape of his slider over the course of the season. They loved the pitch data associated and the pure swing and miss associated with his fastball. Mid 90s, high 90s fastball. With incredible spin on it. So it has kind of 2 plane, it has ride and cut, and then he developed this what was functioning as a wipeout slider off of that, as well as a curveball. And so there's a lot of intrigue around him, and I hadn't spent much time at all thinking about him until the very end of the season, where he had starts. I forget if it was 1 hit in 9 innings or no hits in 9 innings over the course of 2 starts late in the year with Salem. But he's someone they're pretty pumped about, and who the data gives them reason to be pumped about. So he ended up kind of coming out of nowhere for me,
mm-hmm.
Into a higher spot than I'd anticipated. Beyond that, I guess. Other people, I'm not sure if Chris Murphy qualifies as a surprise, but, he was very impressive in Lowell. Left-handed pitcher, seems to, have very good feel for pitchability, 4-pitch mix. So that creates a pretty high floor and an ability to move relatively quickly through the system. So he's a guy who I think, was clearly being held up as one of their better prospects. Guys who really slipped. I mean, I had Anthony Flores very high last year in my top 10.
Yeah.
I told you guys at this time last year that one organization had him as their number 1 Red Sox prospect. Yeah. And he had a dreadful year in Lowell, mm-hmm. to the point where he's just barely hanging on to a prospect list for me at this point. And, mm-hmm. It was honestly a pretty good question of whether or not he belonged in one. Same thing with Danny Diaz falling off the tables, off of just, he got sent back from the GCL to the DSL in the middle of the season, even though he has enormous raw power.
Mm-hmm.
They're good, instructive cases of how volatile those kind of highly regarded prospects in short season ball can be, whether it's whether it's someone who's signed internationally, or a high school kid who people are like, oh, great tools, and those tools just don't materialize in pro ball.
Yeah, it's always tough too, because you don't remember the guys who disappear like that, right? I'm not saying that those guys are done. They could certainly come back and have a good year this year and increase their prospect stock just as quickly. Maybe not to where it was, or maybe to where it was.
But look, you have Michael Almanzar as a case study, and the guy who came over, super highly regarded, and his stock took a hit, and it just he kind of bounced back at times, but never really got it back, and
mm-hmm.
ended up being a cup of coffee guy.
Right.
But you also have guys like, let's say, Felix Duran, who got it handed to him at a certain point after he'd been successful in Greenville. I think he got demoted from Greenville to Lowell, I want to say, back in 2007, and he used that as a platform after getting shelled at both of those levels to put his career back on the right track and to become what ended up being a valuable prospect and ultimately a solid contributor to a championship team. So yes, you don't dismiss. That's why guys like that, it's hard for me to take someone like a Flores who had been ranked so highly and to drop him off the list completely, but it's awfully close.
Mm-hmm. Can I just take a second to appreciate the 2007 Felix Duran poll that you just had? As someone who takes pride in his polls of old stuff on this podcast, that is outstanding work.
I may be off by a year, so I don't want to.
Oh no, it was 07. I just looked. It was. Nice. He started he was in cool. Greenville. Had an ERA of 8.93, and even in Lowell, his ERA was 5.66. So, I had. It was
time for Felix to grow up.
Yeah, that's wow. Good work. I'm rarely impressed by such things, and I'm impressed with that one.
Right. The Sox Prospects trivia night is going to be something to behold.
Oh, that would be fun. That we need to make that happen. I don't know who the quiz master would be. Maybe Keith, but yeah, that would be fun. One guy that we've had all kinds of issues trying to figure out how to rank him. If you're there's certainly a conversation to be had about the exercise of ranking all players as though they are all apples or all oranges. But
yeah.
What did you hear about how people are feeling about Jay Groom at this point? I got the question on Twitter, I think last night actually, about, what am I looking for out of Jay Groom this year? And I just said pitch the full season healthy at this point.
Yeah.
But, we actually have a reader question about him that we'll get to. But it's just, what was the sense that you were getting of what is his status in terms of how he's thought of, what even is the projection that the team or externally people have for him at this point?
You're right to be all over the place with it. Like put it another way, like talking to a scout of another team, he was like, I don't know if I could really put him in the top 10 anymore because it's just been so long since he pitched. And I said, well, what if your organization was given a choice of making a trade with the Red Sox of, let's say, like, Mazza, Dalbec, or Groom? Who are you taking? And he was like, maybe Groom. So, it's like, so yeah. There's still this, like, there's like, it's still this, this complete mystery, right, of how he's going to come back. Last year, he had velocity when he came back in Lowell at the end of last year. So I think that's viewed as a kind of a promising sign. Mm-hmm. But he didn't have the Jay Groom curveball in that little flashback at the end of the year back in Lowell. So, he's still, no one has any idea.
Right.
Like, this is the year where you figure out what Jay Groom is. Right now, it's just kind of conjecture. And, he's got to show that he can be healthy for a year, and he's got to show that he can be healthy with stuff for a year.
Yeah, and it's not even like you can ding him for not having the curveball in his first start at that level.
Yeah, of course not. No, years. That's completely expected, right?
Right.
Like, the fact that he was on the mound and had good arm speed, is a pretty significant accomplishment for him.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question that we are forced to answer about every other podcast. We reported on kind of the latest news on Noah Song on that last kind of report with regard to, the Navy or the Naval Academy had submitted their, recommendation not to grant him the exemption, but that's because they were reading the letter of the, new policy to the T, and, they weren't really considering making an exception. But I need to ask, because I'm sure people would be mad if I don't ask you, is there any news on Noah Song?
I got nothing. Yeah, okay. I haven't. Yeah. As of the last time that I checked, there was still no word about an assignment to Pensacola or anything. I mean, it's like, it's a unique situation, right? Like, the people who are like right now, like, where the person who ultimately, if the Secretary of the Navy, who would only be the acting Secretary of the Navy, signs off on Song's waiver request to simultaneously, like, be in the reserves while also pitching for the Red Sox, what Esper is going to have to, like, is going to have to stop giving press conferences about Iran in order to take stock of whether or not Noah Song should be pursuing a professional career. So, it is a unique and challenging process.
Yeah, it's like this is in the hands of people who really have much bigger fish to fry. This isn't even like a fish to fry. This is like a spot on the radar miles and miles and miles away or something.
Right. Well, right. Like to say, you're talking, right. Like, this is the, like, like, not to trivial, like, Noah Song, like, it's a great opportunity for him. Right. I think that, a lot of people would be happy for him to be able to pursue it. But in relative terms, the question of his professional future is the fish to fry for the Secretary of the Navy, who, like, in an ocean, right? So, so this is this is a very strange bureaucratic landscape that the Red Sox, in which the Red Sox have found themselves kind of entrapped.
Yeah. Ian, anything that you want to ask about the rankings? I know I've kind of monopolized Alex for a bit here.
Yeah, come on, Chris.
Yeah, sorry. But, anything you wanted to ask about, and then I think maybe we can hit some questions, and then it looks like the Red Sox have...
Yeah, they made a trade. I was gonna mention that. While we were recording.
We could get Alex's instant reaction to... The Red Sox traded a guy I don't know that I knew they had.
I'd never heard of him. They DFA'd Marco Hernandez again, though.
Okay, good to know. This is all happening. This is all unfolding in real time.
Let's get your reaction. They acquired Austin Bryce from Miami. Tell us everything you know about him, please.
That is the sum total of what I know about him.
They traded minor league shortstop Angeudis Santos. I did not know he was in the system.
He hit like 120 last year and had 4 extra base hits the entire season.
Okay.
In the DSL or something?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, all right.
Well, Bryce was DFA'd by Miami, so I guess they didn't have much leverage there.
We are seeing a depth-driven approach to upgrading the 40-man roster, right?
Yeah,
like,
my goodness.
That's
the one takeaway, right?
Yeah,
that is different. That is, like the fact that the Red Sox keep making these trades around the fringes of the roster is one, a reflection of their focus this offseason when they're kind of working around payroll constraints, and two, it reflects the fact that they see organizational fluidity, right? Like this is not a fixed roster. This is a roster subject to change. If you have an opportunity to upgrade at the margins, you take it rather than kind of committing to roster stability. So I guess that's the takeaway.
And I think it's kind of like it's taking almost more of the Tampa Bay Rays approach, or how they've been doing it the last years. Is roster spots 39 or 38, 39, and 40 are just as important to them as 20, 21, 22,
and for that matter, 41 and 42, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Like some of these guys are going to be like Marco Hernandez getting DFA'd is spot 41 in a way, assuming that he clears outright waivers.
Yeah. Exactly. So I guess kind of circling back after that breaking news to the list, can you talk a little bit about like what you were hearing about Duran Feltman? Because obviously coming into last year, and I know as someone who got a lot of questions about him as could he help the big league club last year, obviously Double-A was a little bit of a stern test for him, probably more so than that was expected. What did you hear coming on him? Because I noticed he just barely made your top 30.
Yeah, he was kind of a pedestrian reliever in Double-A last year, and you probably saw this. There were efforts to go from being the college power pitcher who's just who's just like comfortably entering into the game 97 to 99, beating other guys with velocity wherever he throws it in the strike zone. In that case, it was kind of down in the strike zone. College teams are still throwing at the knees, right, and finding success that way. That's not the case in the major leagues. So, get into pro ball, and all of a sudden he's trying to make more of a concerted emphasis on attacking that top of the strike zone and spinning this very vertical breaking ball off of that heater at the top of the zone. Didn't command either of them. So people weren't chasing the breaking ball. People weren't, and he was missing the zone with the fastball, or he was finding too much of the zone with the fastball and suddenly became homer prone. So it was a tough developmental / learning year for Duran Feltman. That said, I do think that they felt like over the course of many conversations, and again, this was all happening against the backdrop of Double-A, so it's an advanced level. Like that's you're throwing a guy in, you're throwing a guy into the deep end by having him at that level, particularly given all of the conversation about this guy could fast track that existed around him.
Well, you even got the invite to spring training too. You got the invite to spring training too. Not the invite. He got pulled up.
He got pulled up a few times to pitch in front of the big league team, and the reality is this was a learning year. In 2018, they know what they saw. Right, they have pitch data that shows that he had. That he had a fastball and a curveball that both would play as plus pitches in the big leagues.
Yeah, I've seen it. You've seen it, yeah.
Right. This year, his velocity ticked back, everything ticked back. But it's kind of like what we were talking about with some of the short season guys. Like you don't bury the possibility that that's still in there. And so I think that the fact that he's on the list at all is a reflection of who he's been in the past, and not wanting to give up on that, because organizations make mistakes by giving up on guys too quickly. I think that the Red Sox don't want to make that mistake with Feldman, but they've, this gives them a chance to, maybe this gives them a chance to kind of just allow him to catch up to where he's at, like to get his feet beneath him, and he may well be back in AA at the start of next year. They want to give him an opportunity to succeed. But they invited him to the rookie development program, which is also a reminder of the fact that they still see a pretty significant amount of potential with a guy who had a bad year.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I just in general, like looking at the list, I think Noah Song was the only one of last year's draft class to make the top 10. But they have a few guys in the 11 to 30 range, and just in general, given where they were picking, was kind of like this consensus around the game that they did pretty well, considering they didn't really have a first round pick. Their budget was I think the smallest in draft history, I want to say. Yeah. And to turn out with what they did, I mean, I know from being in Lowell a lot, I saw some pretty interesting guys there. So just was wondering.
Yeah, well, the last couple of years they've done pretty well in terms of later round picks in the draft, right? Like they don't have, The guys who they've gotten who have been relevant on day 2 and day 3 picks is pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. When you look at that, they've done a good job of kind of zeroing in on talented guys who aren't going to be asking for who aren't going to be asking for first round money, but who have a chance to make impact that be meaningful contributors to a big league team. So yeah, Song, people were like dazzled by Song in some respects, but there's that huge question of, okay, so what now? And no one knows the answer to that.
Yeah. Still.
Right. Still. Excuse me. And then beyond that, I think that, Lugo kind of, can be a bit of a head turner. People really liked Cannon in college. He was just so bad in Lowell that it kind of adversely hit his stock for me a little bit. Like,
yeah,
if Cannon had been really good in Lowell, I could have imagined him being a consideration for the top 10, maybe like bumping ahead of like a guy like CJ Chatham, just missed. Mm-hmm. But he was so bad in Lowell that, you kind of have to account for that in some fashion, right?
Yeah.
Like you guys have seen it over the course of the years, like how many guys who end up being really good players end up struggling like drastically at Lowell.
There's like
I don't know
3.
that it's a ton.
It's like Mookie Betts and like, yeah.
Well, Mookie hit for average and he got on.
I guess there was no
bases.
Yeah. There just wasn't any power or anything.
There wasn't power, but like, solid performance for a little guy at that level. I think back to like Bryce Brent striking out like crazy and being like, do you have to factor that in as a data point or like, do you just dismiss it? And nope. It turns out he was always going to have problems with swing and miss.
I remember like Colburn Vidic too being in Lowell.
Yeah.
And like there was some interesting stuff, but it was just like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was like, really? Like that's a first round pick?
Yeah.
But yeah. No, because it seems like I think the pitching staff is what stood out for me with that Lowell team.
Yes.
Like Murphy, who you said, I like Zephyr John. And then I'm forgetting, Aldo, who you have a little lower on the list than we do. Just kind of like it seemed like it was, as we've talked with you before, how they really struggle to develop starting pitching. It seems like, I don't know what it is, if it's a concerted effort or whatever, but they've been identifying guys who look like who look more like starting pitching prospects, I would say, than in their past.
Well, the problem with the past was that they identified guys who looked like literally looked like starting pitchers, but then didn't have the stuff to match that, right?
Right.
And now they're taking a far more broad-based approach, driven a lot more by pitch data. They do a good job of I think that they've done a really nice job with their minor league system of integrating draft scouting reports with their analytics department on the player development side to be able to work with guys and to kind of get them to figure out more productive mixes earlier, they're experimenting a lot more with guys, and sometimes it swings and misses, right? Like they had Tanner Houck in his first full pro season, attacking a lot more with fastballs, four-seamers, that is, in order to see how would that play? Like, how would a curveball play? Didn't work. Mm-hmm. Okay, go back to the two-seam and the slider and work on the changeup and see where that takes you. But they're willing to take more experiments in a bit more of a risk-reward strategy rather than letting guys develop for like 4 years, right. Fastball, curveball, changeup, and then having them get up to AAA and finding out, oh, the Emperor has no close. This guy has nothing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like that's like Henry Owens, I think, is one of the best examples of that. Like, he was someone who he had the fastball, he had the changeup, and they tried the curveball, they tried a slider, they tried everything. But at the end of the day, he would always just go back to the changeup. And I don't think it ever did him a service that he went through like a lot of the low minors throwing. He could just, because his changeup was so good down there. Yeah. But then you get to the higher levels, and guys are just going to sit on a 76 mile per hour changeup.
Right. When you don't have when you can spit on the fastball, then the changeup is going to give you a lot of problems.
Yeah, because I think the pitch mix thing is what was interesting to me, because I know talking to some people, like a lot of the guys down there, they were exposing to changeups, so they were kind of like fiddling with pitches, grips, and everything, which is something I just didn't remember them doing in the past, or in the past years they have. But exactly,
more Rapsodo, like it's Rapsodo and
the high speed cameras,
electronic cameras, and it's and they're They've done a lot more pitching lab stuff in order to try to get a quicker gauge on how good guys can be. And I think it's yielding fruit. And Lowell, to your point, was super interesting to me, because I went into this season thinking that Lowell was going to be perhaps their most interesting affiliate based on their position players, like athletic guys like Gilberto Jimenez and like a guy like Decker who has tools, and a guy like, and for that matter, like a guy like Northcutt who had, who's kind of hitterish, if you want to call him that, and just they looked like they had, Cannon was there. It looked like they were going to be a group that had interesting position players, and then all of a sudden it was the pitchers who really ended up standing out.
Yeah, I remember like you could go in any given night, it didn't matter who was pitching, it was going to be someone interesting, and even like with even before the draftees, and then once the draftees came, it got even like further reinforced.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Well, Alex, we've had you on for a while. Maybe we'll just do some quick emails and we'll let you go if we're not already over.
Sounds great.
Okay.
No, I'm good.
All right. Our first email.
I've got to research Austin Bryce though.
Okay. Maybe we can help you with it or something.
Okay. Very good.
All right. Our first email comes from John, and the question isn't the interesting part of this, but it's kind of a caveat he adds, which I think might lead to a more interesting question. He asks, realistically, where do you think the Red Sox will finish in the division this year? ... with or without Mookie Betts? Thanks, John. Which, I mean, the division finish piece is what it is, but it kind of gets to something I was going to ask about of what the heck is the team going to look like this year? Do we even know yet?
No, we don't. I think that's been one of the fascinating things of this offseason, that, it's been kind of working in suspended animation. The free agent market moved, boom, 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 lickety split. And the trade market has taken all of this time to materialize, right? There just haven't been, aside from like the, Tommy Pham move or
the Rays.
The Rays, right?
The Rays are single-handedly carrying the trade market.
yeah, they're picking, right. Jerry DiPoto gave them the magic wand this year. So I think that there's, I think that with a month left until reporting, there's still potentially significant change that could be on the horizon. And so that does make it really difficult to forecast change. But, I think that it is worth taking stock of the fact that the underlying mission remains being a competitive team, right? Like they wouldn't willingly step back for a year and just say, we'll punt this year and get back to it. So, I think that my guess is that no matter what moves they make, look, we also shouldn't look past the fact that they'll have Devers, they'll have Bogarts, they'll have some talented outfielders, they'll have some talented starting pitchers. Like, I think that a second or third place finish, neither of those things would be surprising for the Red Sox this year, depending on how the division shakes down.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the odds are that this is the team more without any significant changes that they trot out on opening day?
It's just hard for me to believe that they wouldn't make at least one major move in order to shed some payroll. But could be wrong. Maybe they truly don't find any deal to their liking in that regard. But hard to believe that that's going to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Sounds right. Our next question comes from Kyle. He actually has two, but one we've kind of talked about. He says, appreciate all the hard work you do to provide us with information about the Red Sox prospects. Quick two-part question. One, Alex, do you have any thoughts on the group selected for the rookie development program? Specifically, Feltman and Leyer are interesting to me. It's an interesting list of guys. We'll have mentioned before we run the interview, Alex, who the players are. Did anything stand out to you as interesting in that group?
I mean, I agree that Leyer is kind of interesting given how brief his time was in the Red Sox system. You figure that, the invitation to the rookie development program maybe was a little bit of a carrot that was thrown his way in order to get him to re-sign with the Red Sox as a minor league free agent. Little surprised that Eduard Bazardo didn't get invited once he did make it through the Rule 5 draft, because he's a guy who I'm sure you guys have talked about plenty, but who seems like he has the ability to come up and help sometime this year. And I think that the inclusion of Thad Ward is noteworthy, just underscoring the fact that that's a guy who who's really jumped into he's an important part of the Red Sox pitching conversation moving forward. There's a chance that he could, he could get to the big leagues faster than Bryan Mazza. They're probably both going to start the year in Double-A, and depending on what happens with Thad Ward, he's emerged as an interesting part of the Red Sox most promising wave of starting pitchers in a while.
Yeah, it seemed interesting that there were three guys who hadn't been in Double-A yet, although one of them's admittedly the Rule 5 pick, and Johan Ibar's on the 40, so that makes sense. But it seemed a relatively younger group than maybe we're used to seeing, although I didn't research that. So
I haven't either.
Yeah. The second question Kyle had was, with Jay Groom a candidate for the Rule 5 draft after the season, do you think that impacts anything with regards to his assignment to begin the year, or if it maybe makes him a more likely trade chip?
No and no. I think that you let his development dictate where he's going to be, and the play is he's a longer view guy. If you believe that the upside is there, that even if he doesn't progress beyond Greenville this year, you would probably still think about protecting him from the Rule 5. But I expect him to open the year in Greenville. I think that the Red Sox are hopeful that he'll get above that. And I don't think that. I think that if you believe that his ceiling remains that of a number 3, number 2, they'll know when he's on the mound. But if you believe that that's the ceiling, then you wouldn't trade him just because of the time horizon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the timeline, I mean, if they added Johan Ibar, having not, I'm correct that he didn't pitch in Portland yet, right? Am I wrong on that?
He hasn't. No, he has not pitched above Salem yet.
Right.
Denji Reyes is still on the 40-man, and he's probably going to be back in Double-A to start the season. So.
Right, and he hadn't. I don't think he hadn't pitched in Portland yet when they added him prior to last season. So. Yeah, correct. I mean, if he gets to Salem this year, then that puts him on a protection timeline for sure. Our final question comes from Aaron. He says, "Hey guys, question for Alex. If you haven't recorded yet, which we hadn't, would just love a look inside his head when the book, which prominently features Dombrowski's thinking and ends on a largely positive note about his view of the future, comes out weeks before Dave Dombrowski was fired. How did he react if the book was still in the works? Then would the entire book take on a different tone?"
So I guess there's a couple of caveats. So initially I was supposed to be done with the book by opening day.
Okay.
The deadline got pushed back into the middle of April. Okay. That was enough time that it had been a few weeks of the Red Sox playing poorly that I was able to say, you know what? We should note the possibility that the final note of this is not going to be a triumphant one, and that instead, the 20, I tried to account in that final chapter. You alluded to it, some of the conversation about the prospects who hadn't panned out along the way. I believe I felt good at this. I didn't feel good for Dave Dombrowski being fired. I did feel good about the book having kind of accounted for the possibility of things taking a pretty significant U-turn for the Red Sox. Right. So I think that the final note of it is somewhat measured. And then, would there have been a different tone of it? Well, I'll put it this way. There's another chapter to be written in perhaps a subsequent edition of the book.
Well, that's why that's as sports fans, that's kind of why we're here, right? There's always another chapter to write and you don't know where it's going to go. So yeah, it's we talk about rankings being a snapshot in time, and maybe that could apply to a book as well. I mean, there's a story to be told, and it's a part of a larger one.
Yeah, no, I mean, the shape of organizations, like individuals, you're absolutely right, can shift pretty quickly. And so we get a lot of reminders about how we really don't know everything. Sometimes more, or perhaps more accurately, we don't know very much. The juxtaposition of those two seasons, like we'd seen it before in 2013 to 2014 with the Red Sox, in even more dramatic fashion, going from a championship to last place. So I think that to me it underscores the idea that when success occurs, it's important for people to enjoy it and to appreciate it, because it's always fleeting to some degree, unless you're the Patriots of the last 20 years, but now they fleet.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess maybe somewhat unfortunately on that not completely hopeful note, but I guess it's at least partially hopeful.
Alex, sorry, I have a cold, but that got me.
No, it's fair. Thank you so much for your time. We love having you on as always. We hope to run into you in March down in the fort.
Cannot wait. I really hope that's the case, and we'll start thinking about how to have that big Sox Prospects trivia night. Like, it would be it would turn out some. I would like to see the people who came for it, and I'd like to see the questions that arose because of it.
Would you like to see the people who came for it, though?
Oh, hell yeah!
All right, yeah. I guess that could be an interesting.
They're my kind of people. So.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, man. We'll let you get back to things. Have a great weekend, and we'll hopefully be talking to you soon, whether
great.
on here or on the fields, or maybe over a pint or four.
Look forward to any or all of the above.
Excellent.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, man. All right. Well, hopefully you guys enjoyed that interview with Alex Speier. We love having him on. We want to thank him for coming on. We want to thank you for listening. As always, we want to thank Podcast Joe 2.0 for putting together and editing the podcast. As I said, emails to podcast@soxprospects.com. Follow us on Twitter. You can follow the site account @SoxProspects. I'm @SP Chris Hatfield. You can follow Ian @Ian Cundall. That's IANCUNDALL. Ian, great episode. Happy New Year. We'll be back soon, probably with an emergency podcast, I feel like.
We're at about that time where it's going to happen.
That time. It's going to happen.
But we're back. It's the new year.
Love it.
And it's almost baseball season. Again, it sneaks up on you fast, eh?
It really does. It really does. We'll be talking to you guys soon. Maybe preview the spring training trip or something.
It'll be before then, I bet.
It'll be before then. Yeah, that's true. Hey, if you've got questions, we want to answer them. So send in your emails. Next episode could be heavily email email heavy.
We're also coming up on list season, so I assume we'll have some more guests coming up too.
Yeah, that's true, and we also have our own list. We'll have some updates next time we can talk about. So, Thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back in your eardrum soon.